Mornings inside the Halbert Institute's archive wing were not built for conversation. They were constructed in hushed layers, paper settling, metal shelving groaning softly with age, and the distant throb of unseen mechanical systems that never fully turned off. The light there was not bright, but persistent, filtering in through oxidized skylights and landing like dust on polished wood, making time feel both slowed and weighted. It was a space that did not ask to be filled, it merely endured. Nadine Braithwaite moved through it like memory, familiar, unhurried, and almost unnoticed. Her uniform was the same she'd worn for years, muted blue-gray with a stitched badge that had once read, "Facilities Aid," though the lettering was now almost illegible. No one corrected it. No one asked. Her cart rattled slightly as she pushed it across the uneven floor tiles, filled with rags, polish, and a few ancient paperbacks people left behind without care. She had been there so long that the hallways seemed to lean toward her, recognizing her as something permanent. At 61, Nadine's face carried time with dignity. She didn't speak much, not out of shyness, but because she had long ago learned the difference between being heard and being listened to. The faculty walked past her in measured clicks, holding coffee and unfinished arguments. Students whispered their stress into their phones or buried their faces in screens. She observed all of it the way one watches weather, present but untouched. To them, she was part of the building's background. To herself, she was its witness. Every day she started in the North Wing, moving between the anthropology stacks and the neglected display cases filled with cracked globe models and preserved field notes from scholars long since forgotten. She dusted quietly, aligning chairs, lifting discarded tote bags, returning materials to their designated homes. Her hands worked automatically. But that morning, something unsettled the rhythm. Not dramatically, but enough. A shift in atmosphere. A tension beneath the silence that felt like breath held just beneath the surface. It began with a journal, tucked sideways on a table too neatly to be forgotten, open to a page written in meticulous but slightly erratic handwriting. The ink was fresh, the paper was clean. Yet the notation, angular symbols, non-linear transformations, notations out of sequence, was not unfamiliar. Nadine paused without realizing it. Her eyes scanned the page once, then again. It wasn't just that she recognized the form, it was that she remembered thinking in this form. It stirred something like static behind her ribcage. The room around her did not change. No one gasped. No wind blew through the archives. But inside her, there was a ripple, so faint it could have been ignored, if not for how long it had been since she had felt anything close to recognition in her work. Her fingers hovered over the edge of the page. She did not touch it. She only stood there, for the length of a breath, and allowed herself to remember the last time her brain moved in tandem with numbers rather than procedures. She did not pocket the journal. She did not write anything down. But when she turned away, it was with a different gait. Subtle, but sure. Not like someone who had found a revelation, but like someone who had realized that something once closed was no longer sealed. Her footsteps made the same soft clicks on the tile as always. But now, each click echoed a little longer in her mind, like notes from a half-remembered rhythm returning. That night, Nadine couldn't quite place what had shifted. Nothing had changed outwardly. The city still pressed its cold against the windows. Her apartment still hummed with the same old fridge and blinking smoke alarm. But as she sat down to untie her shoes, her hand brushed the spine of a notebook she hadn't opened in 15 years. And for reasons she didn't question, she left it on the table instead of putting it away. The notebook on her table was not dramatic in appearance. Spiral-bound, the cover frayed where her thumb used to rest, its edges dulled from time and a kind of gentle neglect. Nadine didn't open it right away. She moved around it for most of the evening, folding laundry, steeping tea, sweeping the kitchen floor, not avoiding it, but not rushing toward it either. There was a kind of ceremony in that restraint, the way one approaches something sacred not out of reverence, but because it has waited long enough. When she finally sat down, she didn't flip to the first page. She opened near the middle, at random, and found a half-sketched diagram of thermal wave propagation marked with a question. What if symmetry isn't the root, but the byproduct? She stared at the handwriting, her own, unmistakably, and let the weight of the years between then and now settle over her. The ink had faded. The pencil smudges had blurred into soft graphite clouds, but the thought was still sharp. That was how the evening passed. Page after page, not in search of anything but in recognition of how she used to think, how she used to reason, not just with numbers, but with intention. Her notes didn't chase solutions, they circled them. Ideas weren't declared, they were unfolded, tested, questioned. Her margins were filled with alternate paths and questions left unanswered, not because she had failed to pursue them, but because life had intervened before she could. She had once believed that she would return to it, that when things settled, after her mother passed, after the third move, after the last eviction, she would pick up the thread again. But time does not wait, and systems, once stepped out of, rarely offer a second entry. So she had adjusted. She had survived. She had poured her logic into routine, folded her precision into cleaning schedules and grocery lists, placed her brilliance beneath practicality because it was what the world had required of her. But reading those pages now, Nadine didn't feel regret. She felt reacquainted. The voice in those notes wasn't mournful. It was focused, alive, reaching. She wasn't returning to something she had lost. She was stepping back into something she had kept safe, in silence, for reasons even she hadn't fully understood until now. And the structure was still sound. Her thinking had not aged. It had simply waited for a moment when the world grew quiet enough for it to speak again. She spent the rest of the night not writing but organizing, laying out 3 notebooks, marking themes, placing sticky notes where ideas reappeared across years. It wasn't about catching up. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about threading coherence back through a fabric she'd once started weaving and had never been allowed to finish. She didn't set goals. She didn't map plans. She just prepared the space for thought. Outside, the city drifted into sleep. The radiator clanged. A neighbor coughed down the hall, but in Nadine's small living room, time slowed. Her table, usually cluttered with mail and grocery ads, now held only the essentials: old notebooks, fresh paper, a single mechanical pencil. She sat with her hands resting lightly on the table's edge, not tired, not tense, simply present. The readiness didn't come from urgency. It came from alignment. When she finally rose to go to bed, she didn't close the notebooks. She left them open, one to a partial derivation she had nearly solved in 1994, the other to a margin note she'd written in frustration. They don't see it, but it's there. She smiled faintly. They still might not see it, but she did. And this time, she wasn't going to turn away. 2 days later, Nadine returned to the Institute's reading room, not during her custodial shift, but as a visitor. It was early afternoon, the traffic outside muffled by thick stone walls, and the light that filtered through the tall, dust-veiled windows was soft and impersonal. She carried a thin black folder beneath her arm, filled with copied pages from her old notes. Not to present, not to submit, but because she wanted to look at them in the presence of the place where the silence had broken. The table near the thermodynamics section was unoccupied. She sat without drawing attention, her windbreaker draped over the chair, her folder quietly unfolded beside her. The air smelled faintly of old paper and citrus cleaning fluid, something she herself had sprayed more times than she could count. That dual familiarity made her strangely still. Her hands moved slowly as she opened her new notebook and began writing, not from memory, but from continuation. Her pencil traced the path she had once abandoned, the argument she had only half-formed years ago, now clearer with distance. She didn't feel pressure. There was no looming deadline, no advisor's expectations, no grant tied to the result. Just a question that still lived. And for the first time in decades, she had the time and the quiet to ask it properly. The work wasn't triumphant. It was careful, thoughtful, and it felt like home. Around her, students clicked keyboards and whispered stress into their phones. A research assistant dropped a stack of journals with a grunt. Nadine didn't flinch. She wasn't there to observe or be observed. She was there because the logic had returned, and her mind, well rested by years of suppression, moved with precision she no longer questioned. She adjusted a diagram, rephrased a conditional, tested an identity. It wasn't dramatic, it was simply exact. By late afternoon, she had covered 6 pages in her new notebook, clean, well-structured, with only a few corrections in the margins. The folder with her old notes remained open beside her, its pages acting less like references and more like co-authors, past versions of herself who had never stopped believing the work was worth doing, even when no one else had said so. She packed up without hesitation. No need to rush. She would be back. That night, Nadine cooked dinner. She watered her plant. She watched a weather report she didn't care about. But underneath those motions, the logic continued. A second rhythm that moved beneath her routine, quietly threading each action with its own structure. She didn't talk about it. She didn't share the moment online. She simply knew that tomorrow and the next day, and every day after that, she would sit down and continue. It wasn't ambition. It wasn't the need for vindication. It was necessity. The kind of internal imperative that has nothing to do with external success. Nadine had rediscovered the tone of her own mind, and it had returned not with drama, but with resolve. Her thoughts no longer scattered beneath the weight of survival. They aligned, they marched, they held, and so a rhythm returned. Not of old dreams recaptured, but of dormant ones reawakened. Not to fight a system that once cast her out, but to reclaim the work as hers. Quietly, entirely. Nadine continued to show up for her custodial shifts exactly as before. She emptied bins, wiped surfaces, aligned chairs with near muscular memory. Nothing in her tasks changed, but something in her posture had. A precision lingered in her hands even when she wasn't holding a pencil. She began leaving the institute each day with a folder tucked under her arm, its contents slowly evolving, from private validation to sustained investigation. In the physics department, the tone had shifted, though no one would say it aloud. The anonymous correction on the whiteboard, once thought to be a fluke or a prank, had begun circulating quietly among graduate seminars. A few professors used it in drafts. A visiting lecturer referenced it during a colloquium without attribution, assuming it was internal lore. But no one could trace it. No one knew who to credit. Only one professor, Dr. Thorne, had begun to suspect. Thorne had seen Nadine just once, early in the morning, walking through the north wing with her head slightly bowed, a folder tucked under her arm like a student who had nowhere to be. He didn't approach. He didn't ask. But the look on her face had stayed with him, focused, not frantic, attentive, not apologetic. That image lived in the back of his mind every time he revisited the 5-line correction, which had yet to be challenged successfully by anyone in his cohort. Still, the institution moved with institutional speed. Bureaucracy makes no room for the anonymous and the extraordinary at once. There were no emails, no meetings, no invitations. Just hallway mutterings, a few coffee room theories, and a shared discomfort that the best idea of the quarter had arrived without footnote, credential, or permission. Nadine didn't care, or more accurately, she didn't spend time on whether she should be cared about. Her mind was occupied elsewhere, on a new problem she had rediscovered in one of her old notebooks. She had begun sketching variations, cross-referencing obscure proofs she remembered from grad school, pulling library texts off the shelves, not because she needed to be seen, but because she remembered exactly where the answers had once lived. A second notebook appeared on her desk, then a third. She labeled them plainly, Volume 2, Continuity. Volume 3, Divergence. They weren't declarations. They were maps. She organized them like a cartographer rediscovering a continent no one believed was there. No one helped her. No one interrupted. The quiet suited her. By late spring, a few students began to notice her. Not with awe, not even with recognition, but with confusion. A woman with a badge marked Facilities sat longer than they did at the physics tables, borrowed reference books no one else touched, and moved with a composure they didn't know how to interpret. She wasn't in their class. She wasn't a professor. But she was there, reading Fermi and Penrose like she was rereading a childhood story. And while the building itself remained unchanged, its whiteboards covered in drafts, its labs humming with overfunded experiments, the very air around Nadine had started to shift. Not dramatically, not publicly, but subtly. Some ideas don't demand space. They create it. Recognition didn't arrive with a spotlight. There was no announcement from the faculty, no printed program with her name, no institutional email praising the clarity of her mind. Instead, it arrived in fragments. Questions left on scraps of paper, emails from unknown senders asking, "Were you the one who wrote this?" They came cautiously, as though the senders were afraid to offend, or worse, be ignored. Nadine responded to none of them at first. Not out of pride, but out of preservation. She had learned long ago that attention was not the same as respect. Her work needed no audience. It needed continuity. So she continued, page after page, refining ideas that had once lived only in the margins of her memory. She wasn't rebuilding a reputation. She was protecting a rhythm. It was a visiting scholar from Cape Town, Dr. Amin Dube, who first insisted on clarity. He had encountered Nadine's correction during a closed research roundtable and, unlike the others, didn't treat it as an anonymous artifact. He pressed, he asked, he traced. And when he finally found her name on a quietly circulated staff roster, he didn't hesitate. He emailed. Not out of obligation, but admiration. Nadine opened the message one evening as the sun folded over the edge of her apartment window. It was direct, respectful, and refreshingly technical. No flattery, no curiosity about her past. Just, "Your structure corrected an inconsistency I've been modeling for weeks. I'd be honored to compare derivations." She stared at it for a long time. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew exactly. She responded with a page from her notebook, scanned, annotated, signed only with her initials. No summary, no explanation, just clarity. Within days, Dube shared it during a panel at a regional seminar. This time, he named her. And while most of the room didn't know who she was, the idea took root. Quietly, firmly, undeniably. Back at the Institute, things began to shift. Not publicly, but under the surface. A research assistant added her name to a draft without being told. A graduate student started leaving open-ended questions taped to the edge of her cart. A department head, known for her strict protocols, quietly asked the admin to check if Nadine had an academic file on record. The answer, of course, was no. But it no longer mattered. Her contributions spoke for themselves. They moved through equations like current, undeniable, untraceable to the system, yet utterly essential. What she had written couldn't be erased, and more importantly, it couldn't be ignored. Nadine didn't step into the center of the stage. She didn't even stand near it. She simply remained where she had always been, moving quietly through the spaces others overlooked, writing in the language that had once belonged to her and now belonged to no one else. She didn't need their permission, but they were starting to understand they might need hers. What moved me most about Nadine's story wasn't the fact that her brilliance was eventually noticed. It was that she kept working long before anyone paid attention, and long after they might forget again. She didn't demand recognition. She didn't frame her intelligence as defiance. She simply chose to remain in conversation with her own mind, even when the world stopped listening. That kind of steadiness, that kind of quiet insistence on returning to the work, is something I've come to respect more deeply than any polished resume or framed certificate. Her story reflects a truth I think we're all overdue to recognize. Not all genius is loud. Not all brilliance demands attention. And most importantly, not all value comes with a credential or a spotlight. Some of the clearest, most structurally elegant thinking happens quietly, off the clock, off the record, in the blank spaces between what we're paid to do and what we feel compelled to keep alive inside us. I've been thinking a lot about how many Nadines we walk past every day, people whose minds are sharp, complex, deeply alive, but whose brilliance goes uninvited simply because it doesn't arrive in the expected packaging. Maybe they never finished school, maybe they burned out early, maybe they had to step away for reasons that were never fully seen or understood, or maybe they're just quietly doing the work in places no one's thought to look. And it makes me wonder, how much have we missed because we assumed that intelligence comes with a title? How many answers are sitting in notebooks under beds, in thoughts never said aloud, in people who've been told they're overqualified for the lives they now live? I think the saddest thing is, we don't just lose their insights, we lose the kind of thinking that comes from people who've had to rebuild themselves outside the system. That kind of clarity isn't just smart. It's essential. It's built in reality, tested in silence, and sharpened by survival. So yes, maybe there's a Nadine in your workplace. Maybe she's bagging your groceries, or fixing your software bugs, or cleaning the lab at 6 a.m. Maybe she's someone in your family who stopped talking about what she used to love because no one listened long enough to care. And maybe, just maybe, there's a Nadine inside of you, the part that still sees the pattern, still hears the rhythm, still wants to write it down, even if no one's asking for it. If this story stirred something in you, I hope you'll share it, not for numbers, not for clout, but because these voices matter. Because we need more ways of telling the world. Brilliance doesn't require permission, and clarity doesn't need applause to be real. Leave a comment, pass it on, click the like button. And if you want more stories like this, ones that don't just entertain, but make space for people we usually overlook, make sure you're subscribed. I'd love to share more with you. And remember, this story was fictional. But the silence it describes? That's the part that never was.
Still.